Imagine a 15-year-old girl who coldly murders her own mother and then smiles on camera. How did a seemingly innocent teen turn into a ruthless killer? Stay with us as we dive into the chilling case of Gregg, a twisted tale of manipulation, deception, and a mind that no one truly understands. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Stay tuned, because this story will leave you speechless. The streetlight flickered, casting jagged shadows on the pavement. It was late, silent, except for the faint hum of cicadas. Inside the house, the air felt thick. A single lamp illuminated the living room. The couch was frayed, its cushions stained with time. A framed photo stood crooked on the mantel. Carly stared at it. Her mother's smile. Frozen. Mocking. Her fingers trembled as she tightened her grip on the knife. The blade caught the light, sharp and unyielding. Her breathing quickened. Each inhale felt like swallowing fire. Her mother's voice echoed from the kitchen. A casual hum. The clatter of plates. Carly stepped forward. Her sneakers barely made a sound on the old carpet. The knife felt heavy in her hand. The hum grew louder. Closer. Her mother emerged, holding a dish towel. "Carly?" she said, her voice tinged with surprise. Carly froze. The weight of her gaze felt unbearable. "What are you doing with that?" Carly didn't answer. Her chest heaved, heart pounding like a drum. Her mother's smile faltered. A step back. The towel slipped to the floor. "Carly, put it down," she said, her tone firm now. But Carly couldn't. Her grip tightened. The silence stretched, thick as molasses. "Put it down," her mother said again. Her voice cracked. The air between them buzzed, electric and suffocating. Carly took a step forward. Her mother's eyes widened. The kitchen clock ticked, each second slicing the tension. Carly lunged. A scream shattered the stillness. It echoed through the house, a sound of pure terror. Blood splattered the walls. It painted the floor in dark, glossy streaks. The knife clattered to the ground, sticky and wet. Carly stood motionless. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Her hands trembled, slick with red. The room smelled of copper and fear. She turned slowly, her eyes glassy. The camera on the shelf blinked red. Recording. Her lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. A cruel, haunting smile. The kind that stayed with you. Forever. The camera whirred softly, capturing everything. Its blinking red light felt alive, staring back at her. Carly tilted her head, examining it like a curious child. Her smile didn't falter. The house was silent now, except for the faint dripping. A soft, rhythmic patter. Blood pooled near her sneakers, dark and viscous. It crept toward the corner of the room, finding the cracks in the old wood. Her mother lay crumpled, lifeless. Eyes wide, mouth frozen mid-scream. The knife sat inches away, its blade reflecting the dim glow of the lamp. Carly wiped her hands on her jeans, leaving smears of crimson. She moved toward the camera, her steps deliberate. Slow. The room seemed smaller, as if the walls were closing in. Her shadows stretched across the floor, warped and jagged. She reached out, fingers brushing the camera's edge. The lens reflected her face. That smile. Empty. Cold. Her fingers hovered over the stop button. But she didn't press it. Instead, she leaned in closer. Her breath fogged the lens, warm and shallow. A whisper escaped her lips, barely audible. "Are you watching?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. She straightened, gaze flicking to the window. The curtains swayed gently, stirred by an unseen draft. The world outside seemed distant, unreal. She turned her back on the camera, leaving it to document the aftermath. In the hallway, her footsteps echoed. The floor creaked beneath her weight, each sound sharp and jarring. The bathroom door was ajar. A cracked mirror hung above the sink. She stared at her reflection. Her face was streaked with blood, her cheeks smeared with red handprints. Her eyes were hollow, unrecognizable. She leaned closer to the mirror, tilting her head again. A laugh bubbled up, soft at first, then louder. It filled the tiny space, wild and unrestrained. Her voice echoed back at her, fractured and distorted. The girl in the mirror smiled back. Identical, but different. Somehow darker. She turned abruptly, the laughter dying on her lips. The hallway stretched before her, endless and shadowed. She walked toward her room, leaving crimson fingerprints on the wall. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The stuffed animals on her bed stared blankly. She sat down, the mattress sagging under her weight. Her hands rested on her lap, still sticky. She looked at them, tilting her head once more. The sound of sirens pierced the silence, faint but growing louder. Her smile returned, slow and deliberate. She whispered to the empty room. "They'll come for me." Her voice was soft, almost sing-song. "And I'll be ready." The sirens grew louder, a wailing crescendo cutting through the night. Red and blue lights painted the walls of her room, flickering like a pulse. Carly sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the window. Shadows danced across her face, but her expression didn't change. That smile lingered. Outside, tires screeched to a halt. Car doors slammed. Heavy boots thudded against the pavement. Voices called out, sharp and commanding. "Police! Open the door!" Their shouts echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a stark intrusion. Carly rose slowly from the bed. Her bare feet pressed against the cold floor. The weight of her movements felt deliberate. She walked to the window, parting the curtain with one finger. The scene below was chaotic. Officers swarmed the front yard, weapons drawn. Neighbors gathered at a distance, their faces pale with fear and curiosity. Carly let the curtain fall back into place. She turned, her footsteps echoing faintly as she moved down the hall. The house was darker now. The faint red of the recording light still blinked in the living room. The knife lay abandoned on the floor, glinting in the intermittent flashes of light. The front door shuddered under the force of a battering ram. A hollow thud, then another. The frame cracked, splinters flying. The door burst open, slamming against the wall. "Hands up!" A dozen voices roared at once. Officers flooded the entryway, guns aimed and flashlights cutting through the shadows. Carly appeared at the top of the stairs. Her figure was backlit, her face obscured in shadow. Her hands were raised, palms out. The crimson smears gleamed under the harsh light. "I did it," she said, her voice clear and steady. She stepped forward, descending slowly. Each creak of the staircase was deliberate, measured. An officer shouted again, "Stop! Don't move!" But she didn't stop. Her eyes locked on the nearest officer, unblinking. Her smile widened. The kind of smile that chilled the room. The kind that stayed with you. Forever. Carly reached the bottom of the stairs. The tension in the room was suffocating. The officer's hands tightened around their weapons. "Stay where you are," one shouted, his voice cracking slightly. Carly froze, her head tilting to the side, bird-like. The flickering red and blue lights bathed her face in an eerie glow. Her smile hadn't faded. The air felt charged, like the seconds before a storm. "Drop to your knees," another officer commanded, louder this time. Carly's eyes scanned the room. Each officer was poised, muscles taut, weapons steady. She took a step forward. The room erupted with sound. "Stop! Don't move!" She raised her hands higher, her movements slow and deliberate. Her voice cut through the chaos, soft and almost sweet. "Are you scared of me?" The question lingered, a needle threading through their collective nerves. An officer moved forward cautiously. His flashlight illuminated her fully now. The blood on her hands, the streaks on her jeans, the splatter on her face, smeared like war paint. "Get down," he said, his voice firmer. She didn't answer. Instead, she lowered herself to her knees. The hardwood floor creaked beneath her weight. Her hands remained raised, palms facing outward. The room buzzed with tension. "Cuff her," one of the officers said, nodding to his partner. The younger officer stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly. He knelt beside her, pulling her arms behind her back. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into her wrists. Carly didn't resist. Her smile remained, faint but unbroken. As the officer pulled her to her feet, she leaned in close. Her voice was barely a whisper. She deserved it. The words sent a shiver through him. He stepped back quickly, his face pale. The officers led her toward the door. The house seemed to sigh in relief as they moved outside. The flashing lights illuminated her face for the crowd. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. But Carly didn't notice. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, her smile unshaken. As they loaded her into the back of the patrol car, she turned to the camera crews that had gathered. Her lips parted. A single, chilling sentence slipped out. "You'll remember me." The car door slammed shut, and the night swallowed her whole. The patrol car sped away, its sirens cutting through the uneasy silence of the neighborhood. Inside, Carly sat still, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. The dim red glow of the car's interior lights cast shadows across her face. She stared straight ahead, unblinking, her reflection faintly visible in the partition glass. The officers in the front seat exchanged glances, their faces tight with unease. One of them, the younger man, cleared his throat. "Did you see her smile?" he muttered. His partner didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted the rearview mirror, catching Carly's gaze for a fleeting moment. It sent a chill down his spine. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice low. "It's unsettling." Carly tilted her head slightly, as if she'd heard them. But she didn't speak. Her silence was heavier than words. The city blurred past the windows, streaks of orange streetlights and shadows from passing cars. The sirens faded, replaced by the hum of the engine. They pulled into the station, the high walls and floodlights looming like a fortress. As the car rolled to a stop, officers outside gathered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and dread. The younger officer exited first, opening the back door. "Out," he said, his tone wavering slightly. Carly stepped out slowly. Her bare feet touched the cold pavement, sending a faint shiver through her body. But her face remained calm. Her smile lingered, faint but unbroken. They led her into the station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow. The smell of disinfectant filled the air, sharp and chemical. Officers in the booking area turned to watch as she entered. Conversation stopped. A strange, heavy quiet followed her. The desk officer cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Name?" he asked, glancing at the paperwork. "Carly Gregg," she replied, her voice steady and soft. Her tone was almost cheerful, as if she were introducing herself at a party. The officer paused, his pen hovering over the paper. His eyes flicked up to meet hers. She smiled wider, leaning slightly toward him. "Don't worry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sorry." The room seemed to freeze. The officer's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. No one moved. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the station's wall clock. Seconds stretched into an eternity. And Carly? She just stood there, smiling. The room's silence was suffocating. All eyes were on Carly, her smile cutting through the tension like a knife. The officer behind the desk hesitated before clearing his throat, regaining composure. "Take her to holding," he instructed, his voice tight. Two officers stepped forward. "Come on," one of them said, gripping Carly's arm. She didn't resist. Her steps were light, almost playful, as they led her down a narrow hallway. The air grew colder the deeper they went. The walls were stark, lined with scratches and faint stains that hinted at the history of those who'd come before. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was constant, grating. Carly's bare feet made soft, rhythmic taps on the tiled floor. Her escorts didn't speak, but they exchanged uneasy glances, their grip on her arms tightening slightly. The holding cells came into view, rows of metal bars illuminated by harsh, white light. Empty faces stared from within, silent, curious, or simply indifferent. One man leaned against the bars, his eyes narrowing as Carly approached. "What's she in for?" he asked, his voice rough and taunting. The officers ignored him, but Carly turned her head, locking eyes with the man. Her smile widened, slow and deliberate. "Something unforgettable," she said, her voice soft yet piercing. The man froze, his cocky demeanor slipping. The officers unlocked an empty cell and motioned for Carly to step inside. She walked in without hesitation. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating down the hall. The officers lingered for a moment, as if reluctant to leave her alone. But eventually, they turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the distance. Carly stood in the center of the cell, taking in her surroundings. The bench, the sink, the faint smell of bleach and rust. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the scratched metal mirror on the wall. She tilted her head, studying herself. Then she sat down on the bench, crossing her legs delicately. From somewhere deeper in the station, a clock chimed softly. The sound carried through the corridors, marking the hour. Carly leaned back against the cold wall, her smile never faltering. Time moved slowly, but she wasn't in a hurry. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle over her. The faint hum of voices echoed from the hallway, distant and muffled. And then, clear and unmistakable, came the sharp click of heels on the tile floor. Approaching. Carly opened her eyes. Her smile grew. She knew someone was coming, and she was ready. The sharp sound of heels grew louder, precise and unyielding. Carly straightened her posture, her head tilting toward the cell door. Her smile remained, fixed like a mask. A woman appeared at the end of the hallway, tall, composed, and dressed in a crisp navy suit. Her presence commanded attention. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, not a strand out of place. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand, her other hand clutching a thin file. Her gaze was sharp, cutting through the stale air as she approached. The other inmates fell silent, their curiosity palpable. The woman stopped in front of Carly's cell. She looked at her with a mixture of interest and calculation. "Carly Gregg," she said, her voice cool and professional. Carly said nothing. She merely stared, her smile curling wider at the edges. The woman stepped closer, her heels echoing on the tile. Her eyes flicked to the crimson smudges still staining Carly's hands and clothes. She didn't flinch. "You've caused quite the scene," the woman continued. She glanced at the file in her hand, flipping it open. 15 years old. No prior record. And yet, she paused, her eyes narrowing as she read. "Brutally murdered your own mother." Her words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Carly leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. Her smile didn't waver. "What's her name?" Carly asked, her tone almost playful. The woman raised an eyebrow. "Agent Lila Kane," she replied. Carly nodded, rolling the name around in her mind. "Lila," she said softly, savoring it. "I like that." Agent Kane ignored the comment, stepping even closer to the bars. Her voice dropped, low and steady. "Why did you do it, Carly?" Carly tilted her head, as if considering the question. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, their hum filling the silence. "I had my reasons," she said finally. Her voice was calm, unnervingly so. Agent Kane didn't blink. "Enlighten me." Carly's smile widened, her eyes glinting with something dark and impenetrable. She leaned back against the wall, the cold metal pressing into her spine. Because, she said, her voice light and airy. It felt right. Agent Kane's expression hardened, her fingers tightening around the file. The room seemed to grow colder, the walls pressing inward. Kane exhaled sharply, closing the file with a snap. Interesting, she said, her tone clipped. She turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked away. Carly watched her go, her smile still fixed in place. As the sound of footsteps faded, she leaned her head back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. Her laughter started soft, then grew louder, echoing through the empty corridors. It was a sound that didn't belong in that space. A sound no one could ignore. The laughter echoed long after Agent Kane disappeared down the corridor. It was sharp, hollow, and unrelenting. Carly let it pour out, her head tilted back against the cold cement wall. Her voice reverberated off the steel bars, crawling into the ears of every inmate and officer within range. Some shifted uncomfortably in their cells. Others pressed their faces against the bars, curious and unnerved. The sound grew louder, filling every corner of the station, until, suddenly, it stopped. Carly's silence was abrupt, as if a switch had been flipped. She tilted her head forward, staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable now. A faint smirk lingered, but the wildness in her laughter was gone. The distant hum of voices and footsteps resumed, a faint reminder that the world still turned outside her cell. Moments later, a new figure appeared in the hallway. This one was younger, with a nervous energy that betrayed his inexperience. A rookie officer, clutching a tray of food. His uniform was crisp, but his hands trembled slightly as he approached Carly's cell. She watched him intently, her eyes tracking his every move. He stopped just outside the bars, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Dinner," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Carly didn't respond. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, graceful. The officer stepped back instinctively, nearly spilling the tray. He fumbled with the latch of the slot in the cell door, his hands shaking as he slid the tray through. Carly crouched down, her movements eerily calm. Her eyes never left his. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice dripping with an unsettling sweetness. The officer nodded quickly, retreating a few steps before turning and hurrying back down the hall. Carly chuckled softly, the sound low and almost private. She picked up the tray, examining its contents. A sandwich, an apple, a small carton of milk. She bit into the sandwich, chewing slowly, her gaze fixed on the far wall. The silence of her cell was broken only by the faint sounds of her eating. But her mind was racing. Images flashed behind her eyes. Her mother's face, the knife in her hand, the camera's blinking red light, and Agent Kane's cold, calculating stare. She smiled again, broader this time. Something about the way Kane looked at her had intrigued her. There was more to that woman than the suit and the file. Carly was certain of it. She finished her meal, setting the tray neatly on the floor. Then she stood, pacing her cell slowly, her bare feet making soft, rhythmic taps. She stopped in front of the bars, peering out into the hallway. The faint buzz of the station hummed in the background. She licked her lips, savoring the quiet. Her voice was a soft whisper, just loud enough to carry beyond her cell. "They'll come back," she murmured to herself. "And when they do, we'll have more fun." The hours dragged on, the fluorescent lights above, never dimming. Carly sat cross-legged on the cold floor, her back against the wall. The faint echo of activity in the station was her only company. She stared at the cell door unblinking, as though willing something or someone to appear. And then faintly footsteps. They were measured, deliberate, familiar. Carly's lips curled into a slow smile. Agent Kane was back. The woman emerged from the shadows of the corridor, her presence sharp and commanding. In her hands was a manila folder, thicker than before. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. Kane stopped just outside the bars, looking down at Carly, who remained seated on the floor. "You're not asleep," Kane observed, her voice calm and even. Carly tilted her head, her smile widening. "Too much to think about." Kane raised an eyebrow, then nodded toward the bench. "Sit up. Let's talk." Carly obliged, unfolding her legs and rising gracefully. She perched on the edge of the bench, her posture relaxed, her eyes locked on Kane. "What do you want to talk about?" Carly asked, her tone light, almost sing-song. Kane opened the folder, flipping through pages of notes, photographs, and reports. "You're a puzzle," Kane said, her tone clipped. "No history of violence. No signs of abuse. No clear motive." Carly shrugged. "Sometimes things don't have a reason." Kane's gaze sharpened. "Everyone has a reason, Carly. Even you." The girl leaned forward slightly, her fingers interlaced in her lap. "Maybe," she said, her voice soft. "Or maybe I just wanted to see what it felt like." Kane's jaw tightened. She pulled out a photograph from the folder and held it up to the bars. It was a picture of Carly's mother, smiling in a sunlit garden, oblivious to the future. "Did she deserve it?" Kane asked, her voice steady but probing. Carly's smile faltered for the first time. Her eyes flicked to the photograph, then back to Kane. "She wasn't who you think she was," Carly said, her tone colder now. Kane didn't look away. "Then tell me who she was." Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Carly's smile returned, smaller, darker. "Why should I?" Kane closed the folder with a deliberate snap. "Because the truth always comes out, whether you want it to or not." She turned on her heel, her footsteps echoing as she walked away. Carly watched her go, her smile lingering, but her eyes burned with something new, something deeper. As the sound of Kane's heels faded, Carly leaned back against the wall, her voice a whisper in the empty space. "She was the beginning," she murmured. "And this is just the start." The station was quieter now, the usual buzz of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. Carly's eyes followed Agent Kane's retreating figure until it disappeared down the corridor. The silence in her cell was almost suffocating, but it didn't seem to bother her. She stood up slowly, as though savoring the stillness. Her bare feet made barely a sound as she moved across the cold floor, closer to the bars. She pressed her palms against the metal, the cold seeping into her skin. The world beyond the walls seemed so far away. Yet, Carly knew something had shifted. Something was coming. Her smile returned, wide and unsettling. Her fingers traced the lines of the bars, the cool metal against her skin grounding her in this moment. The clock on the wall ticked, louder than before. Each second felt like a weight, pressing down on her chest. It wasn't long before the sound of footsteps returned. Not Agent Kane this time, but a figure she recognized. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of authority. Detective Harris. He walked toward her cell with a purposeful stride, his face grim. The door to her cell opened with a mechanical groan. "Carly," he said, his voice low, but there was something in his eyes. Something different from the others. He stepped inside the cell, stopping a few feet away. Carly didn't move, her eyes fixed on him with that unnerving smile. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp. Harris didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. "I'm not here to talk about your crime," he said, his eyes studying her intently. Carly raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you here for?" He took a deep breath, his eyes flicking to the door as though to make sure they were alone. "I'm here because you're more dangerous than anyone realizes." Carly's smile remained, but a glint of something darker passed through her eyes. "Is that so?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock innocence. Harris didn't back down. "No one understands you," he continued, his tone harder now. "You think you're playing a game, but it's more than that. You've got a plan. A bigger picture we don't see yet." Carly tilted her head, her smile twisting into something more sinister. I don't have a plan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Plans are for people who think they have control. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. I don't need control. Harris stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. I'm not buying it, Carly. You're not some mindless killer. Her smile faded for a moment, replaced by something colder. I never said I was, she replied, her voice low and dangerous. Harris hesitated, his eyes searching hers, looking for a crack. But Carly held her ground, the calm in her expression almost unnerving. I didn't kill her because I had to, she said, her voice steady now. I killed her because I wanted to. The words hung in the air between them, thick with a cold finality. Harris's expression faltered for just a moment. And in that moment, Carly's smile returned. Wider, warmer, like a predator savoring its next move. Harris took a slow step back, his eyes never leaving Carly. Her smile felt like a trap, like the calm before a storm. For a moment, the tension in the room seemed to thicken, stretching out the seconds between them. He tried to steady his breathing, but something in her presence made it hard to think clearly. You're not like the others, he said, his voice firm, though a hint of uncertainty lingered. Carly's smile deepened, a slight chuckle escaping her lips. No, she agreed softly. I'm nothing like them. The silence that followed felt almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Harris shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his gun, but he didn't move to draw it. The truth, however distorted, was sitting right in front of him. And that truth was more dangerous than he could have imagined. He took another step back, his eyes scanning her cell, the dull, flickering light above them casting long shadows across the concrete. You're playing a dangerous game, Carly, Harris said, his voice low and controlled, though the edge was unmistakable. Carly didn't answer immediately. She simply stood unmoving, her fingers gripping the bars again. The quiet buzz of the lights overhead seemed to reverberate through the air, making the silence between them feel even more profound. After what felt like an eternity, Carly finally spoke, her voice breaking the tension with a soft, deliberate murmur. You think this is a game, don't you? She asked, her gaze unwavering. Harris swallowed. No, he said firmly. This is real. Her eyes glinted, a hint of something twisted behind the surface. You don't get it. She took a slow step forward, her eyes locked onto his. This is everything. This is my reality. Harris stood his ground, though he felt a ripple of unease crawling up his spine. I don't care about your game, he said, his voice a little less certain than before. I care about stopping it before it spreads. Carly's smile never wavered, but her eyes darkened. Oh, but you're already too late. Her words hung in the air, cold and final. Harris flinched, a fleeting sense of dread running through him. She stepped back, breaking the tension by settling once more on the bench. Her demeanor had returned to its unnerving calmness. The predator had retreated into the shadows, waiting. You don't even know what's coming, she said, her voice almost gentle now. You're not ready. Harris swallowed again, trying to shake the chill creeping down his spine. You're wrong, he muttered. We'll stop you. All of this. Carly's smile flickered for just a second. But I don't think you will. She leaned back against the wall, her eyes following him as he took another step toward the door. And as the door clicked shut behind him, Carly closed her eyes. For the first time since their conversation began, she allowed herself a full, contented breath. She knew Harris wasn't going to stop her. No one was. Her plan, whatever it was unfolding piece by piece. And no one was prepared for what she had in mind next. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in the empty hall, leaving Carly alone once more in her cell. She didn't move at first, her eyes still closed, savoring the quiet after Harris's departure. The weight of his words had come and gone, but their impact was fleeting. She knew he didn't understand. None of them did. Carly opened her eyes slowly, her gaze drifting to the flickering light above. She could feel the plan unfolding within her, like a secret waiting to be revealed. A slow smile crept across her face as she stood up, her movements deliberate and graceful. The cell was small, but it felt like the entire world was contained within these walls. She walked to the bars again, pressing her palms flat against the cold metal, staring into the empty hallway. Her mind buzzed with thoughts, strategies, possibilities. Every moment in this place was another piece of her puzzle. And Carly was patient. The clock on the wall ticked louder, each second passing like a heartbeat in the dead of night. She didn't mind the waiting. In fact, she relished it. The anticipation of what was to come was a delicious thing. She heard footsteps again, but these weren't the slow, deliberate steps of Agent Kane or Detective Harris. These were hurried, more frantic, the sound of someone trying to get somewhere quickly. Her smile widened. She turned to face the door, her eyes lighting up with an almost childlike excitement. The door to her cell swung open without warning. 2 officers rushed in, their expressions tense, their hands resting near their holsters. "Get up," one of them barked. Carly didn't move at first, her smile widening in response to their urgency. "What's the rush?" she asked, her voice soft, taunting. "Out of the cell." "Now," the second officer ordered, his patience wearing thin. Carly stood slowly, her posture as poised as ever. All right. No need to be so serious," she murmured, stepping toward the door. But as she did, she caught a glimpse of something in the hallway. A shadow. A shape moving too fast to be a regular officer. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it. Her smile remained undisturbed, even as the officers flanked her on either side, guiding her down the corridor. She could feel it now. Something was about to shift. She didn't know what it was yet, but it was coming. And Carly was ready. The officers ushered her into the interrogation room, the sterile white walls closing in on her. They motioned for her to sit, but Carly remained standing, her eyes scanning every corner of the room. Something was off. The door clicked shut behind them, and that was when she heard the sound, the soft click of a camera. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Carly caught it. Her eyes locked onto the lens, hidden in the corner of the room, watching her every move. She let her smile slip, just a little, but it wasn't fear she felt. It was curiosity. Who was behind the camera? Why the sudden change in the way they were treating her? Carly's mind whirred, piecing together the possibilities. And then, without warning, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't an officer or an agent. It was someone else entirely. Someone with an air of authority, a confidence that made the room feel smaller. Her heart beat a little faster. Carly knew the game was changing. The door creaked open slowly, the sharp sound piercing through the silence of the sterile room. Carly's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't flinch. She was used to waiting, used to watching the world shift around her, knowing that at the right moment, she could make her move. A figure stepped into the room, tall and imposing, their silhouette framed by the harsh light from the hallway. Carly's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression unreadable as she studied the newcomer. The door swung shut behind them, the click of the lock echoing in the small room. The person stood in front of her, silent for a moment, their eyes assessing her with a calculating gaze. Carly tilted her head slightly, her smile returning slowly, almost imperceptibly. The figure didn't speak at first. They simply watched her, as if trying to gauge something deeper. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of stillness, they spoke, their voice low and confident. "You've been quite the mystery, Carly." Carly didn't respond immediately, instead letting the silence stretch, enjoying the moment. She studied the figure more closely now, sharp features, eyes that seemed too calm for the weight of the situation. Their posture was controlled, almost unnervingly so. "Who are you?" Carly asked, her voice soft but pointed. The person's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. "You can call me Agent Bishop." Carly's smile grew, a flicker of recognition passing through her mind. Agent Bishop. She had heard that name before. Not in the reports or files she'd seen, but in whispers. The kind of whispers that spoke of people who were more than they seemed. The kind of whispers that hinted at things beyond the surface, beyond the simple labels of crime and punishment. Agent Bishop took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know what you've been doing, Carly," he said, his tone deliberate. "And I know why you did it." Carly's expression didn't falter, though her pulse quickened slightly. She had always been ahead of them, always a few steps ahead. But there was something in his words that made her pause, something unsettling about his certainty. "What do you think you know?" Carly asked, her voice still calm, but now tinged with a hint of challenge. Bishop didn't smile. "Enough to know that you're not just a killer," he said quietly. "You're something much more dangerous." Carly's heart beat faster now, but her smile never wavered. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice a whisper. The air in the room grew heavy, the tension palpable. Bishop's eyes narrowed. "That depends on you." There was a long pause before he spoke again, his words deliberate. "You're going to make a choice, Carly. A choice that will define everything." She tilted her head, the darkness in her eyes deepening. "I don't need to choose," she said softly. "I already know what I want." Bishop watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a final, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Carly's voice stopped him. "Don't mistake me for someone who can be controlled," she said, her tone cold and final. Bishop paused, his hand resting on the door. "I'm not trying to control you," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "I'm giving you a chance." Carly's smile returned, wide and unsettling. "I don't need a chance," she whispered. "I've already won." And with that, she turned away, leaving the room in silence once again. But this time, the silence felt different, heavy with the weight of something far darker than before. Days passed, and Carly remained in the same cold cell, her mind racing with possibilities. She'd played them all: Agent Kane, Detective Harris, even the elusive Agent Bishop. But they were just pieces like everyone else. She knew the game better than anyone. It was only a matter of time before the pieces fell into place. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, breaking the monotony. Carly's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as she waited. For the first time in what felt like ages, there was a hint of excitement in her chest. The door to her cell creaked open. Two figures stepped inside, both familiar, but one more so than the other. Agent Kane, her face as cold and calculating as ever, and standing next to her, Detective Harris. Carly's lips curled into a slow, almost affectionate smile. "Back for more?" she asked, her voice low, but no less sharp. Kane stepped forward first, her eyes meeting Carly's with an unreadable expression. "We're not here to play games, Carly," she said, her voice as steady as ever. Carly tilted her head slightly, her smile never fading. "Then why are you here?" Harris, his face worn from endless days of questioning and investigation, glanced at Kane before speaking. "We're here because we know you're hiding something," he said, his voice tense. Carly chuckled softly, the sound almost musical. "I don't hide anything," she said, her tone dripping with mock innocence. Kane's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "We know you've been pulling strings behind the scenes, Carly. The incidents, the messages, the chaos, it all points to you." Carly simply shrugged, her gaze fixed on the two of them. "But what if I don't care about your chaos?" she asked, her voice soft, almost playful. "Maybe you've been seeing things the wrong way." The room seemed to grow colder. Kane's patience was wearing thin. "This isn't a joke," she snapped. Carly's smile never wavered.
To you, maybe.
But to me, she trailed off, her eyes glinting. It's just the beginning. The two officers stood there in silence, the weight of Carly's words settling between them. And for the first time, both Kane and Harris realized something they had overlooked. Carly wasn't playing by their rules. She never had. The door to the cell slammed shut behind them. The silence was deafening. But Carly didn't mind. She leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes, a deep sense of satisfaction washing over her. She was no longer a puzzle to be solved. She had become the one in control. The game was hers to win, and there was no one left to stop her. Her smile widened. It was over.